Well, welcome to the channel, Dr. J.W. Morrison, theologist, Central Coast, New South Wales, Australia. There's a lot of questions about what Allah wants. Trigger warning, viewers. CCTV footage. CCTV captures killer Ahmad Khalid on rampage before murdered stranger. For the people of Gaza, is this what Allah wants? I'd like some answers in the comments. My hands are injured. Hadn't been for that, I would have continued the Ghazwa raid.
مجروحين وما كنت راهن كنت نكمل الغزو.
Okay, Ghazwa. Ghazwa refers to battles of the early years of Islam in which the Prophet himself was present. That's Muhammad, whether he had a military encounter in them or not. The most important Ghazwas include the battles of Badr, Uhud, and Khandak. Okay, the Battle of Badr is the first and most important battle between the Muslims and the polytheists of Quraysh during the early history of Islam. It has been mentioned in the Quran. The Quran has explained about it with special attention in a broad manner in the Quran 8 and 3. The Battle of Uhud was a famous Ghazwa of Prophet Muhammad against the polytheists of Mecca. Quraysh, I'm sorry I'm not pronouncing that correctly, marched out toward Medina as they desired to average their losses in the Battle of Badr, while Abu Sufyan was the commander of the army. These are just summaries. The Battle of Khandak took place in the 5th of Hijrah 627. It initially broke out by the stratagem of Banu Nadir tribe. There is a disagreement among historiographers over the number of Ghazwas. Some take it to be 26. Others take it to be 27. We now turn to this man's trial, terrorist who killed stranger, for the people of Gaza, jailed for life.
You may remain seated for the moment. On the 7th of October 2023, a terrorist group called Hamas, which is prescribed in this country under the Terrorism Act 2000, carried out an attack on southern Israel. Many hundreds of people were killed and over 200 taken hostage.
And just a trigger warning on the left side.
There was widespread media coverage of these events and of the armed response of the State of Israel against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, which also led to many, many deaths. Just a week later, shortly after 5 a.m. on the 15th of October, Ahmed Ali Alid armed himself with 2 knives from his kitchen and tried to kill Javid Nouri, a Muslim convert to Christianity, while shouting out in Arabic, Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest. Then he went out into the street and murdered a complete stranger, Terence Carney, a 70-year-old Englishman taking an early morning walk. He was arrested shortly afterwards, still in possession of the blood-stained knife he had used to stab Mr. Carney, and with the blood of Mr. Nouri on his clothing.
See, in England and Australia, it's very hard to get guns, so they stab with knives.
He thought he had killed both men, and he told the police he wanted to kill them because of the conflict in Gaza, and so that Palestine would be free from Zionists. He made references to historical links between Britain and Israel, He said he would have killed many more people if he had been able to, because so many innocents were being killed in Gaza. At the end of the police interview, he struggled with the two female interviewing officers and assaulted them. Ahmed Ali did not have the courage to admit his guilt in court. He tried to persuade the jury that when he stabbed Mr. Nouri and Mr. Khani, he hadn't intended to kill them or even cause them serious harm. He pretended that the admissions and explanations he gave to the police had been mistranslated by an interpreter, and the political and religious causes he had cited were not his actual motivation. The men and women on the jury saw through these lies. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was convicted on the 25th of April 2024 after a 2-week trial. Sentence was adjourned so that the court had the fullest information and argument before proceeding. The only sentence a court can pass for murder is life imprisonment. The court must then determine whether to fix a minimum term, and if it does, what the minimum term will be, or by not fixing a minimum term, impose a whole life order, which would mean that the offender is likely never to be released. If fixing a minimum term, it must take into account such matters as the seriousness of the combination of the offence of murder and any offences associated with it. In this case, I must sentence for murder, attempted murder, and 2 offences of assaulting an emergency worker in the execution of her duty. Schedule 21 to the Sentencing Act 2020 is the relevant legislation from which the correct starting point for the minimum term of a life sentence for murder must be identified. The first issue is whether, as the prosecution assert, the seriousness of the murder alone or in combination with the attempted murder is exceptionally high, such that the starting point is a whole life order. It's argued on the defendant's behalf that the seriousness is not exceptionally high. Rather, it is either particularly high because the murder was aggravated by racial or religious hostility, or it is to be assessed on the basis that the murder was committed with a knife taken to the scene of the crime. A second issue is the submission on the defendant's behalf that there is mitigation to be found in a lack of significant premeditation, the absence of typical terrorist mindset evidence, his previous good character, and a mental condition that he had at the time. This has been diagnosed by a consultant psychiatrist as an adjustment disorder. The jury's verdicts do not provide the answers on these issues because they were not asked to determine the defendant's motives, which were not any part of the ingredients of the offences charged. Like a jury, a judge must apply the criminal burden and standard of proof when determining the basis upon which to pass sentence. Any doubt must be resolved in favour of the defendant. Having presided over the trial and read the psychiatric reports provided to the court after the convictions, I am sure of the following facts. Ahmed Ali Alid speaks Arabic and some English. He is 45 years old, having been born in Morocco in 1979. He gave evidence that he ran a business in Algeria before leaving that country in 2007. He has no history of mental illness. Late in 2020, he travelled by ferry from Holland to England. He had no lawful right to enter the country. He was not challenged by border force personnel, but at some stage afterwards, he was arrested. He told the jury that he came to Britain to find work. However, after his arrest, he applied for asylum, claiming that he could not return to Algeria because criminals who falsely believed he had reported them to the police would harm him. He told a psychiatrist, Dr. Mark Turner, who interviewed him in December 2023, and again in March 2024 before the trial, that he came to Europe in search of a better life for himself. He tried to get work in several European countries without success, and before arriving in England, he had sought and failed to obtain asylum in Spain, France, Germany, and elsewhere. Police inquiries established that he had been detained in immigration detention in the Netherlands, on the Swiss-French border, and in Germany, where he had spent at least 3 periods of time. No decision was made on his claim by the Home Office until after he had been charged with these offences. His application for asylum was refused on the 3rd of November 2023. Meanwhile, in 2021, he was allocated a room in a house in Wharton Terrace, Hartlepool, where other asylum seekers were living. Ahmed Alid was devout, chaste, and teetotal. He prayed 5 times a day, ate only halal food, and took part in communal prayer in a mosque. He stayed in touch with his family by phone. A counter-terrorism command investigation has found no evidence in his social media, phone records, or elsewhere of any links to or communication with any extremist Islamist individuals or groups. On the 5th of August 2023, Javid Nouri, a 31-year-old man from Iran who had converted to Christianity, moved into the house. He spoke Farsi and was learning English. He and the defendant were not on good terms from the start. He remonstrated with the defendant for his lack of cleanliness, and this led to resentment on the defendant's part. Mr. Nouri upset the defendant by other behaviour, including using a shared fridge to store beer, which he considered disrespectful. Although they didn't speak the same language, Mr. Nouri realised that the defendant was extreme in his religion and considered him, Mr. Nouri, an apostate, one who has voluntarily denounced Islam. In some Muslim-majority countries, apostasy is a criminal offence, sometimes punishable with the death penalty. The defendant would curse both Mr. Nouri and another resident who he thought behaved in a way that was haram, forbidden in Islam, such as inviting a girlfriend into the house. He was heard saying that they were the devil, that Allah should damn them. Unlike the other residents, Mr. Nouri, a physically large, strong man, was not afraid to confront and argue with the defendant or make light about his fastidiousness with food and conduct. Another man, who sometimes stayed in the house as a guest, told the jury that the defendant thought of them as garbage. After Israel declared war against Hamas on the 8th of October and announced a siege of Gaza the next day, Mr. Nouri became concerned because he saw the defendant watching on his mobile phone what Mr. Nouri called footage of terrorist news. He was laughing and praising Allah when the footage showed that Hamas had killed children and women. Mr. Nouri noticed that the defendant would keep a knife out when he was in the kitchen, even if he wasn't using one. Mr. Nouri contacted friends at the local church, the charity Migration Help, and those responsible for managing the accommodation to tell them that he thought his life and those of the others in the house were in danger. His instincts were right. He was advised to go to the police, which he did. After that, the accommodation staff visited and spoke to the defendant, telling him that if he carried on behaving as he was, he would be asked to leave. They were satisfied that the defendant would heed their warning. When Mr. Nouri went back to the police by arrangement on the 13th of October, he was prepared to trust the defendant would change, and the police concluded it was a matter for those responsible for the house to manage. By this time, of course, the armed forces of Israel were carrying out military action in Gaza and warning people to evacuate. It is clear from thumbnail images found later on the defendant's phone that he had viewed distressing media output of the conflict. This was mainstream and YouTube footage. He had also heard that his mother was ill. The evening of the following day, 14th of October, Mr. Nouri noticed the defendant watching him when he returned to his room after a bath. At around midnight, the friend who sometimes stayed overnight and who understood some Arabic arrived at the house and heard the defendant shouting and swearing in the corridor about religion. He was saying, "These shameless, faithless people, I hope God puts them in hell, in the deepest part of hell." Several hours later, at around 5 a.m. on the 15th of October, Javed Nouri was asleep with the door to his room locked. The defendant went into the kitchen, took out 2 knives and broke into Mr. Nouri's bedroom. He attacked Mr. Nouri, stabbing him twice in the chest and shouting, "Allahu Akbar." Mr. Nouri woke up and fought him. One of the knives was broken in the attack and fell to the floor. When tested later, the blade bore DNA matching that of Mr. Nouri. It was dark and he was terrified, but he knew he had to resist and overpower the defendant, who then tried to stab him in the neck, catching his mouth. In the struggle, he managed to wound Mr. Nouri in the leg, causing him to collapse. The victim screamed to rouse the others in the house. He got hold of the defendant in a headlock and disarmed him of the knife he still had. In response, the defendant punched him in the head and tried to find the other knife, continually shouting, "Allahu Akbar." The struggle and the defendant's words were caught on the 999 call made from the house. Mr. Nouri managed to pass the knife he'd got hold of to one of the other men, who threw it away in the hallway before running upstairs to hide from the defendant until the police arrived. Despite feeling faint from loss of blood, which was significant, Javed Nouri held onto the defendant until he was able to maneuver him out of his room. Even then, Ahmed Alid picked up the knife that had been thrown away in the hall and tried to get back into Mr. Nouri's room. He prevented this by putting his weight against the door from the inside. And Javed Nouri sustained 2 wounds to his chest and wounds to his lip, thigh and calf, as well as cuts to his back, a finger and bruising to his head. I am sure that the defendant waited to assault him until he was asleep and vulnerable. Mercifully, the attempt to kill Javed Nouri was unsuccessful. When armed police eventually entered the house,
Might I say, the Hamas terrorists on the October 7th attack in Israel were fighting against unarmed civilians.
and found him, he had low blood pressure due to the severe blood loss,
Actually,
and
they
his
were
condition was
assassinating
potentially
unarmed
life-threatening,
civilians.
although the defendant had failed to strike any vital organs or cause internal bleeding. The life Mr. Nouri had started to build in this country was shattered by what happened. He has had to move to another part of England. He has lost proximity to his friends and community links. He has been left with psychological injury. He says, "All my thoughts of here being a safe country have gone. I would expect to be arrested and possibly executed for converting to Christianity in my home country. I did not expect to be attacked in my sleep here." Returning to the 15th of October, Mr. Terence Carney was a local man from Hartlepool, the port town in County Durham, who enjoyed walking in the peace of early mornings. He was someone of quiet habits, strongly connected to his wife and daughter, who miss him deeply. Their powerful impact statements remind the court that the defendant's random targeting of a lone man in the street has touched many lives and more than one generation. The sentence I pass, whatever it is incapable of undoing the harm the defendant has caused to that family. No period of incarceration would be equivalent to the life he has taken, and that's not the purpose of sentencing. Having been thwarted in his murderous attempt on Mr. Nouri, the defendant walked out of the house and down the road. He held the knife in his hand and was captured on CCTV footage holding it up in the air. As he walked along, he continued saying, "Allahu Akbar." After just a few minutes, he approached Mr. Carney, who saw him and crossed the road to avoid him. What happened is recorded on CCTV footage. The defendant went over to him, still holding the knife. He confronted Mr. Carney, who gestured that he didn't want to engage with him. Ahmed Alid then attacked that unarmed elderly man who was unable to defend himself. I am sure that the defendant gave a deliberately false account in evidence and to the psychiatrist about what happened between him and Mr. Carney. He said to the jury that he was walking along saying, "Free Palestine," and in response, Mr. Carney made a pejorative and racist remark to him. He told the psychiatrist that upon hearing this, he felt as if Mr. Carney was responsible for Israel's actions in Gaza and reacted by stabbing him, but only in the leg, at which Mr. Carney fell to the ground and said, "Israel, Israel," at which the defendant left. I am sure, from the CCTV footage and the medical evidence that as soon as Mr. Carney saw the knife and tried to get away, the defendant attacked him, stabbing him repeatedly in the body. The knife he used had a 20-centimetre blade. At one point during the assault, he dropped the knife, but picked it up again to continue stabbing his victim. And when the injured Mr. Carney fell, the defendant got himself into a position so that when he got up again, he could strike him again in the chest. Cries are heard on the footage, and it's likely that Mr. Carney was begging, "Please, please," which is what the defendant told the police in his interview. But he showed him no mercy. He left him lying on the road. Mr. Carney was treated by emergency services, but all efforts to save his life were futile, and he died on the roadside, close to where he had been left. He had sustained 6 stab wounds and a number of other injuries in the attack. He died of massive internal bleeding caused by 3 of the wounds, which had pierced his lung, his liver, and his heart. The defendant was arrested within 20 minutes of the attack with the knife in his waistband. He had injured his own hands with the knives he had wielded. At the police station, he made unsolicited comments in Arabic directly into an officer's body-worn camera, stating that he had acted for the people of Gaza and, inshallah, God willing, Gaza would return to being an Arab country. He was agitated and had to be told to sit down. Among prayers praising Allah and condemning those who do not believe or who stray from Allah, he said that had his hands not been injured, he would have continued what he called the Ghazwa, a battle or raid against non-Muslims. He said that Jews had divided the Arabs and the army of Muhammad would return to live in Al-Quds, which is Jerusalem. And at that time, non-believers would be humbled and have to pay tax to the Muslim rulers. He was seen by several medical professionals at the police station and assessed. The cuts he had caused to his hands were treated in hospital. He was fit to be detained and to be interviewed. In an interview the following day, in the presence of an independent solicitor and an interpreter, the defendant confessed to the attempted murder of Javid Nouri and the murder of Terence Carney. Initially, he believed he had succeeded in killing both men. He explained that the issue was the independence of Palestine. He had killed 2 adults in revenge for Israel killing innocent people and children by airstrikes, which demolished buildings and destroyed infrastructure.
See, this is what they do. They're bringing their Middle Eastern resentments and unresolved issues to the Western world, and they're continuing on with these resentments and unresolved and taking them out on the peaceful people of the Western world.
He repeatedly expressed the view that the dunya, this world or humanity in general, was rotten. He said that if he had had more weapons and a machine gun, he would have killed thousands. He described Mr. Carney as an innocent victim who was killed because Britain had created Israel, which he called the Zionist entity. He predicted that Britain was on the verge of a flood, unrest, and an explosion if Israel did not leave Gaza.
And this is what they're trying to do in all the Western countries that they're entering. They're blaming the Western countries for the problems in Gaza. Now on the left you'll see the Australian Senate, and you'll hear what's supposed to be an Australian Green senator, trying to put a conscience on Australia for holding back money from UNRWA, a United Nations humanitarian supply organisation that sends humanitarian supplies into Gaza, which were being siphoned by Hamas to the multi-millions of dollars worth. It wasn't getting to the Palestinians, so Australia and several other countries stopped their support. This is what you get from these fanatics.
The department. Could I just start by tabling UNRWA's latest situation?
This is her channel. I won't subscribe to it or like the video, but this is the attitude of these people in the Western world. Now, this is Australia, so we're not far behind Britain. Listen to this.
report as of 10th February. I think the Secretariat has the reports, which really paints a picture of...
Sorry, has it been agreed by the committee? I assume that's been agreed.
Sorry, what was that?
She's tabling a report. It's a report we already have, but I'm happy for her to table. But I'm assuming you've agreed it.
No, I'll have a look at it first.
Okay,
As been my past practice, I'll review it before we table. But we can distribute for information only.
I thought we had...
It's not mine.
But
It's the Senators. I'm just asking.
Anyway, the report also reports on at least almost 28,000 Palestinians who have been killed by Israeli attacks. 70% of those killed are reported to be women.
Just let me say, these Israeli attacks, it's Israel trying to destroy Hamas.
Women and children, and another almost 68,000 Palestinians who are injured, as well as 156 UNRWA staff who have been killed as of 10th of February. Minister, on 27th January, you announced suspension of funding for UNRWA along with some other nations, effectively punishing 2 million people in Gaza by depriving them of critical support that UNRWA...
See how they're trying to blame the Western world for the problems in Gaza? It's a joke.
...provides. This is really tantamount to the Australian government further inflicting collective punishment on Palestinians.
No, we were inflicting wisdom on the fact that UNRWA had thousands of Hamas workers who were taking the humanitarian aid into the tunnels and wherever else they needed it for away from the Gazian people. This is the mentality of these people.
He said that Britain would be a wreck. He claimed he was ready for his own shahada, martyrdom. There is no evidence that the defendant had or sought access to a firearm in the UK, although in his evidence he said he had known someone in Germany who did. During the interview, he became irritated with the interpreter. After it ended, he got up and blocked the door, preventing the officers from opening it. His solicitor was so concerned, he made an emergency call from inside the room. When the door was opened from the outside, the defendant lunged at one of the two female interviewing officers, and he refused to release her. The other officer tried to separate them. All three fell to the floor. The officers were one of the two female interviewing officers, and he refused to release her. The other officer tried to separate them. All three fell to the floor. The officers were shaken and one suffered modest injury. The defendant was also convicted of deliberately assaulting two emergency workers. He was charged on the 16th of October, and in response to the two main charges, he continued to reiterate his beliefs and the justification for his actions, namely that the Zionists have killed lots of children and people, far more than those that he had killed, and that the Zionists must go because they are criminal and killing innocent people. He also repeated that the United Kingdom was fully accountable for what was happening in Palestine. The legal principles relevant to the exercise of judgment I must carry out are summarised in the judgment of the Lord Chief Justice in the Crown and Stewart and others in 2022. The key responsibility of the judge is to have full regard to the features of the case before her so that the sentence truly reflects the seriousness of the particular offences. I'm grateful to counsel on both sides for the assistance that they have given me. No pre-sentence report was requested and none was necessary. I have regard to the terms of Schedule 21 and remind myself that reaching a conclusion in a case like this is not a matter of mathematical formula or mechanical application of a balance sheet of features pointing towards or away from a particular outcome. This was a murder, an attempted murder, carried out in revenge for the actions of Israel bombing in the Gaza Strip in response to a terrorist attack. It was also a reaction to the religious conflict with Javid Nouri. The defendant said in clear terms afterwards that his intention was to influence Britain's leaders and its people and thereby advance a religious and political cause, namely that of Islam and the independence of Palestine. The mention of British involvement in the creation of Israel refers back more than 100 years of history. In a letter known as the Balfour Declaration, written to a leader of the British Jewish community in 1917, the then Foreign Secretary committed the British government to establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. A period known as the British Mandate after World War I was full of conflict in the region. The conflict continued after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and as we all know, it continues still. Schedule 21, paragraph 2 states that the appropriate starting point is a whole life order if the court considers that the seriousness of the offence, or of the combination of the offence and another offence associated with it, is exceptionally high, and the offender was over the age of 21 when the offence was committed. The schedule makes it clear that a murder done for the purpose of advancing a religious or political cause will normally be an offence of exceptionally high seriousness. It is on a par with the usual outcome when a police officer is murdered in the execution of his duty. This is because they are both examples of crimes whose magnitude go far beyond the murder of an individual. They are an attempt to undermine and destroy foundational components of an ordered democratic country, where causes are promoted through lawful means, not violence.
These examples of crimes whose magnitude goes far beyond the murder of an individual, they are an attempt to undermine and destroy foundational components of an ordered democratic country, where causes are promoted through lawful means, not violence.
The violence itself was short-lived. Nonetheless, I've come to the firm conclusion, given the defendant's explanation of his motives in the police interview, a whole life order is the correct starting point.
And we'll see you in part 2.